Goal is to make this format as welcoming to your input and participation as possible. So the chat box is located in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can also unmute during pauses for questions and comments at any point during the meeting, and we will help address those. As a reminder, please stay muted unless you have the floor. This will help us avoid background noise. And at this point, I'll turn the floor over to Jenny to kick us off.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Hope everybody enjoyed we gave you a break this month with the Lunch and Learns, so thanks for dialing in to participate today. Before we get started, Sarah Cox, is there anything you wanted to pass along to the group before we really jump in? Might have a little issue with Sarah's audio. We'll go ahead and get started. So today's meeting is very much focused on our freight and economics analysis. We did our Lunch and Learn last month on sort of the basics, the fundamentals of this analysis. So I'm hopeful that you're able to participate in that to sort of get the framework for what you're going to hear about today. We'll start off with just a little bit of a status report on what's been happening over these last several weeks. The team has been working very, very diligently through a series of deliverables. So that's finalizing the network analysis, the land use work, the best practices, performance measures, all those different items that we have presented to you in previous meetings. Those things are coming to a close. And we kind of find ourselves at sort of a halftime in the plan development process where we're shifting from the data collection and the needs understanding, needs assessment, and we're moving in the direction of developing our plan recommendations. So our team of railroad experts, truck parking experts, traffic engineers, all these different disciplines are coming together at this time to start to shape that list of projects and policies that we think would address some of those needs that we've identified so far. Another thing that has been in the works that we have just launched within this last week is the online survey. What this is designed to do is reach out to drivers, operators, warehousers, members of our freight community who are active users of our transportation network to get their feedback on what's working well, what's not working so well, everything from traffic congestion hotspots to perhaps safety issues, intermodal connectivity issues, parking needs, those types of things. So this is a shameless plug to draw on all of your resources. Sarah has most likely emailed you or in some form or fashion connected with you to let you know that this survey is live. And if you need that information, it is available on the plan website. So as we close out the meeting today, we will get that address out there for you. We're going to go ahead and leave that open until October 25th because we want as many people to provide their input as possible. So, you know, the initial momentum on that's been a little slow to crank up. However, I had a great conversation with Rick Todd yesterday. He's going to push a reminder through his membership, through the Trucking Association, and like I said, I would strongly encourage all of you to draw on your resources, whether it's your social media feed, your email list, just friends, colleagues in the industry. It's a very brief survey. It should only take a few minutes to complete, but it is critically important to get that information from our community. So with that, what I would like to do is stop talking, and I'm going to shift into today's presentation. And one thing that is really important that I'd love to ask all of you as meeting participants today is that you listen and learn about the findings of this economic analysis that has been conducted, and know that our next phase of work is to take this presentation and the results of this analysis and turn it into a very user-friendly sort of economic analysis executive summary brochure. And the purpose of this is to provide all of you, your boards of directors, your council members, et cetera, to have a very user-friendly, graphically pleasing story about the value of freight to our local economy in the BCD region. So what we would appreciate is if you could give us your input on how that information resonates with you, the key takeaways from today's presentation, so that we can customize this document as best to serve your needs and the needs of those you represent. So ultimately, what this document will do is help make the case. This really becomes the why. Why are we doing these recommended improvements that we will be laying out in the next phase of work in the plan? So, this really tells the story of what is the value of freight to our region, and that's what we're here to do today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce to you our speakers. Eric McClellan and Evan Bigos were introduced to you in our last meeting with the Lunch and Learn. They gave us the overview of economic analyses as they relate to freight. Eric and Evan have extensive experience developing economic impact studies and economic benefit studies for all sorts of transportation facilities, and have spent a tremendous amount of their professional lives studying freight and its impact on our economy. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric to get us started. Eric?
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Last week we provided an overview summary of what freight is and how it's analyzed from a quantitative perspective in terms of what's moving. And we had started that analysis off by just putting everything into context regarding a number of presentations that we've given over the past few months. This includes the overall freight network and an assessment of how it's doing, where the bottlenecks are, and how much of the bottlenecks are associated with trucks versus automobiles, et cetera, as well as how things are changing. Also looked at land use. And speaking of change, as growth continues to soar in the region, how is it changing specifically and where? Is it residential? Is it commercial? Is it industrial? This all is going to affect freight movements. And then we talk about freight movements. What is moving in terms of volume? And when I talk about volume, I mean tons, I mean value, I mean units. What is moving? Commodity types. Where is it moving from and to? How is it moving? What's the mode? We're going to expand a little bit on that, but more importantly, we're moving towards how those freight movements can be quantified in economic terms. How does the movement in or out of a region or within a region create jobs and income for the firms and businesses that move freight? In addition to the firms that actually transport freight. But most importantly, what are the impacts associated with the production of commodities and goods that are shipped by freight? Together, the freight network assessment, land use, the freight movement, and the economics all provide important information that are directly and indirectly blended into the prioritization measures that are following in the next phase of study. So today's topics, we're going to expand upon that myriad of freight dimensions that were outlined in the past presentation last month. Specifically, we're going to talk about trans-search data and how it's used to quantify the economic impacts and the importance of inbound, outbound, and interregional traffic in the estimation of impacts. And like I said, trans-search was the primary source that we use for freight movements. That's an access database that we conduct a bunch of data pulls and runs to process the data and to validate it in an Excel sheet to understand perspective on a commodity that's moving in a certain direction, its associated value, and how it compares with other commodities moving on other modes in other directions. Having all of the information pulled into a Excel database enables cross-checks to validate the data. The data is then summarized. We summarize in terms of maps and tonnage volumes in the previous presentation last month. I'll summarize some of that, as well as the associated value movements. That tells a different story. All that information is going to be used to estimate the economic impacts. Before we go through the process of impact estimation, it's good to step back and get a status quo of the regional socioeconomics in terms of existing population, employment, income, gross regional product. So when we come up with these economic impacts associated with a freight, we can compare them, not only from a summary perspective, but also by a detailed industry perspective. It provides context for validating, QA/QCing the economic impact estimates. So, freight economic impacts, after we've gone through that process of pulling and validating and summarizing the freight data from trans-search, now we incorporate economic impacts using the in-plan model, which we'll talk more about. That provides additional data to process it and to estimate what the impacts are. Additionally, there's mapping that was done summarized in the previous presentation. All of that goes into the prioritization measures. So, polling question. What freight direction has the greatest economic significance? Interesting, similar type of breakdown, but a little bit different than the previous presentation. Actually, yes, outbound has the most, but the difference between outbound and inbound is a lot closer than you might think. The point being is that a lot of the industries that produce goods and commodities depend on inbound freight. So if they don't get the inbound freight, they can't produce something. Additionally, a lot of the retail and food services depend on inbound freight. Without that, they can't produce something, or they can't sell something. So inbound often is underappreciated as an economic engine and driver, and it's roughly as important as the outbound of finished goods. Interregional is much smaller because it's within the region, and the throughput or through volume has little or no economic impact because it does not associate with local manufacturers and producers who have jobs. Instead, it's just the impacts associated with moving freight, and that's comparatively small. So, regional commodities. We talked about this last week. I'm going to summarize this. Important point is to remember this relationship between geography and directional movements of freight. For example, with the BCDCOG, freight moves to or from the BCDCOG to other parts in South Carolina as well as out of state. So the impacts associated with it are not just in the BCDCOG area, but it also affects other regions. Similarly, other regional freight movements are essential for inbound production of goods and services and sales of goods and services. There's also the intra-regional movement. Of course, that comprises both sides of that equation. And then there's the through movements. For the study region, the vast majority of through movements are truck movements on I-95, just going through the tip of the area. These are huge volumes, which can distort the interpretation, processing, and understanding of the trans-search data. Specifically, last week we showed this table, so it is a rehash. There's a total of 136 million tons of freight. If you break it down by direction, you see that the vast majority of it is by truck, 89 million, where rail comprises the other notable 23 million. And then you have water at 23 million also. The reason it's grayed out is because the values in trans-search are underrepresented because trans-search is based on the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement movements. And it includes ground movements to, from, within the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It excludes movements from overseas, Asia, Europe, South America. So the trans-search movements are underrepresented. To supplement that, we went to the Army Corps of Engineers and used their freight data to quantify what was moving in and out, not only for NAFTA waterbound movements, but also for non-NAFTA movements. So if you incorporate that and you summarize everything together, what you're seeing is that the vast majority of movements, or I shouldn't say the vast majority, but the majority of movements are through movements. Again, we'll see that's mainly in truck, but before I get to that, I want to mention that the inbound movements are notably greater than the outbound movements. So here you can see a breakdown by the different modal types, and that of that 59 million, 52 of it, of the total through movements are truck movements. And truck rail through movements are comparatively small. These values in gray that are masked over for water with the blue background, these are from the Army Corps of Engineers database. And you can see that inbound movements are twice that of outbound. Again, it gives you an understanding of the importance of inbound movements and how it's used, for the production of other goods and services, not only in the region, but the rest of the state and out of state, as well as the goods and final goods that are sold at retail locations. So that 7.8 million of outbound water and 14.8 million in inbound water are actually represented in these trans-search numbers that we see here. That's because trans-search considers them as originating or terminating in the Charleston area, when in actuality they are through movements. So this is one of the issues with the multidimensionality of freight data and how each freight data source has its strengths, weaknesses, but holes and shortcomings, and how we went about addressing that on the water side. So when we talk about the value, we rely primarily on the trans-search. And the total $251 billion of value of freight movement is mostly moved by truck, 211 million, with only 37 million moving by rail. This value, 270, is what TransSearch provided, but it doesn't include the movements from overseas, non-NAFTA movements. But then again, as I mentioned up here, those movements are addressed by the TransSearch as a ground movement originating or terminating via truck or rail. If you look at it on a breakdown by direction, again, this through movement is the major movement at almost 130 million, over half of the total 241 billion. And if you break it down by mode, again, you can see, the breakdown with that through movement being the dominant movement via truck. Value-wise, outbound is greater than inbound. So on the value side, outbound is greater than inbound, but on the tonnage side, inbound is greater. Again, this reflects the variance in the value to weight ratios of the different commodity types by different directions. Regarding economic relevance for the impact estimates, it's the outbound, inbound, and interregional by commodity type that are processed further. Regarding regional commodities and economic significance, non-metallic minerals are the largest tonnage volume. However, the economic significance of it and the second largest movement, secondary traffic, are minimal. Rather, the commodities that generate notable economic impacts include those highlighted here. Transportation equipment is a very interesting one. It shows it's roughly only 4% of what's moved by tons, most of it being inbound. But when you look at the value at 21%, it's the highest value commodity. And it too generates notable economic impacts. All that information goes into the economic impact that Evan's going to show you in a moment. For that, we do have another polling question. What industry sector employs the most in the region?
Hey, Eric, while you're, sorry, Victoria, as people are answering that question, and Victoria will pop the polling question up on the screen. But there's a question, Eric, in the chat box asking if this number includes the movement of empty containers. Where do empties come into this analysis?
Yes, empties are one of the commodity groups that we address. It's a good question, and it is one of those questions that creates an added dimension of analysis. Empty containers have virtually no value, and their tonnage typically isn't that great either. Unit-wise, it is significant. Kenny, does that answer your question? I see you're typing. Or no, that's Coleman who's typing.
Yes, Coleman's typing. Well, it answers the question to me. However, if Mr. Skipper, if you have a follow-up question on that, please feel free to ask it. And it looks like Coleman's question is, would the outbound values exceed the inbound due to the manufacturing values? The raw products are inbound and the finished products are higher in value. Good question.
For a certain industry, yes. However, remember that the inbound volume is not all going to a single industry, and the outbound isn't coming from one single industry. So something that's coming inbound can be used for a lot of different industries in a value-added production, or it could go right to retail. So this is, again, another one of this myriad dimensions of freight analysis. You have to be careful of what you're looking at. So regarding the industry that employs the most in the region, actually it's not manufacturing. It is for the ACOG region, but it's not for the BCD region. As Evan will demonstrate to you, it's more closely aligned with retail trade and a combination of food services.
Eric, there are a couple more questions before we move on to the next section of the presentation. Mr. Skipper had a follow-up question to say that, or I guess it's a little more of an observation to say that we did answer his question, and it is, according to his comment, he says, when looking at the use of infrastructure, empty movement does account for a large portion, and I think that's a very valid observation. Mr. Thompson mentioned or asked the question, the air freight tonnage exceeds the rail, yet less in value. Can you elaborate? You may want to put that slide back up to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's, let me see, is this it? Air, it's only 26,000 tons that move by air versus rail is 23 million. Yes, it's, I've done that myself. I've had to step back and take another look at it. It's easy to get tripped up on this. And, per Kenny's statement, regarding containers, that's why when you look at freight, you have to look at it from 3 different volume components, not just tons, not just value, but also units. Because depending on which metric you look at, you will get a different story.
Okay, good questions. Good questions and good observations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to progress into the next section?
Yeah, I'm going through, and that brings us to the regional socioeconomics, the second part of the 3 parts that we're addressing. I'll turn it over to Evan to give you a backdrop of that and talk about the economic impacts.
Thanks, Eric. So yeah, I'll be covering 2 topics. The regional socioeconomics is just a backstop against what's the current composition of the 3-county area, and that'll serve as some context from which I'll then present the economic impacts that we can then compare to the socioeconomics, just see what the relative contribution of freight industries or freight-dependent industries are relative to the Tri-County area. Just close off the polling question, the highest concentrated employment industry sector in the region is actually government. And that, of course, includes the federal government and military side as well, so that's why it dominates. So just in terms of the 3 counties, from a broad brush perspective, some socioeconomic data that we pull from IMPLAN, which is the economic impact model that we utilize to derive the economic impacts. We'll get a little bit into that later. But for the Tri-County region, you basically have about 800,000 people that have resided there in 2018, with a little less than about 500,000 people employed. Largest concentration is within the Charleston County, which is about a little more than 2/3, and the remainder is pretty closely split between Berkeley and Dorchester. There's about 500,000 employees, produce about $44 billion in value added. which is the equivalent of gross regional product, which is the local equivalent to the national gross domestic product that you'll often see in the news highlighted. That $44 billion in gross regional product basically translates into about $83 billion of output, and that's the equivalent of the final sales value of everything put together, all the goods and services in the Tri-County economy in aggregate. And those numbers may be a little just abstract, just, by themselves, but in the context of the state of South Carolina, those numbers represent between about a sixth to a fifth of the South Carolina economy. So we're looking about 15, 20-odd% of the 46 county state that are located within these 3 counties. With that, I'm going to kind of dig into a little bit of the employment concentration. This slide presents a location quotient. Location quotient represents the relative concentration of an industry, employment in this case, you could do it from other measures, relative to a larger geography, in this case, the state of South Carolina. So as an example, if County A or Region A had a farming employment that represented 10% of their economy, and the state in question had only 5%, the relative concentration of employment in County A or Region A would be twice that of the state, and therefore would have a location quotient of 2.0. That in mind, anytime you see a location quotient greater than 1 indicates a relative employment concentration relative to South Carolina. Anything close to 1 is basically about on par percentages, and anything less than 1 indicates that it is not relatively concentrated. And within the Tri-County region, the relatively concentrated industry by employment includes mining, construction from a goods-related industry perspective, and these are broken down by the North American Industry Classification System, NAICS codes, 2-digit NAICS codes, and the first half dozen usually pertain to goods and production industries, and the last about 10 to a dozen or so pertain to mostly services. The concentrated services in the region include information, real estate, professional services, and art, entertainment, and recreation. And shouldn't come as any surprise given sort of the tourist orientation to some of this region. You can drill this down even further by looking at the location quotients for each individual county, and we have presented herein the top 2 relative to the state, and the 2 highest concentrated industries by employment for Charleston are actually not goods industries traditionally, they're services. It's the real estate and professional services. And the 2 inland counties have a relatively high concentration in mining, Dorchester and transportation, which is unsurprising given I-95 traverses it. And then Berkeley also has a bit of an information concentration. Taking a bit of step back from the industries, though, and aggregating them into the goods and services, and looking at that from a tri-county perspective, the traditionally designated goods industries tend to represent about a quarter of the jobs, the income, and GRP, a little bit more than a quarter. And then from an output perspective, a little more than about a third. Whereas the service-oriented industries, and there are more of them than the goods, constitute a little more than 2/3 from the jobs, income, GRP, and a little more than half from an output perspective. The reason why output's a little bit of an outlier as a proportional representation relative to the other 3 measures are because of the nature of certain industries producing a relatively higher production value per employee than like services industries, typically things that's really reflective of a lot of the manufacturing sector, which is not particularly concentrated in this region, but nonetheless still there. So that brings us to, well, how do we get the economic impacts? Eric had reviewed some of the TransSearch summarized data that we had broken apart in a lot of different angles. TransSearch provides a lot of the directional commodity values, which we can then look at and determine how that blends together with the existing economic data that we have from the IMPLAN database. And IMPLAN does not provide like a commodity directional breakdown, but has industry structure and consumption and production coefficients that can be used to derive economic impacts. And when we blend these 2 databases together, which are not originally intended to do so, but we do for the purposes of freight impacts, we have to adjust for certain things. In particular, we have to take the through traffic out because it's not being produced or consumed in the region. Likewise, we also have to take any overlaps between inbound and outbound that really are just multimodal or intramodal transfers in a region. And because you have the Port of Charleston there, there's a lot of inbound and outbound movements by truck and rail that are then transferred over to water and vice versa that from a regional perspective really are through movements, but transfers will designate them as the partial inbound on one mode and then neglect the water mode because of the NAFTA or USMCA geographic restriction. And in a similar manner to the in and outbound potential overlap, we also have to look at an intra-industry overlap. You can have some input materials, intermediary products go into a production process to be used to produce output that is then shipped out or consumed locally. You don't want to count that intermediary product twice in both, coming into a region and being used to be produced and then sent back out. So we have to tease that out of the process to make sure we're not double counting. And then on top of it, the last thing we have to do is make sure that we're not including any non-valued commodities. Some types of waste, the empty containers, while there's a lot of units, doesn't really have a value. And then just make sure that some of these material movements don't exceed the economic composition, sort of a ceiling. All that together, we use to calculate the economic impacts first by activity. Really, it's driven by the users, the shippers, receivers of the goods, the inbound and outbound and intra-regional movements. And then with that, we measure it by type, the direct, those really attributable to the freight movement itself, the in, the out, and the intra, which then cascade through the economy through multiplier effects. There's two types. One is the indirect, which is the supply chain, and that's where your service providers for transportation come into play, like your truckers, your railroad operators, your port operators. They're part of the supply chain for the users that actually ship and receive the freight themselves. And there's a second multiplier effect called induce, and that's basically the respending of local economy or local income in the regional economy. And it's measured by the traditional measures, jobs, income, GRP, and output, as I alluded to in just giving you the framework of the regional socioeconomics. So once we go through this bridge in the algorithm and we clean up the database, what does it mean in terms of brass tacks numbers for the region? So when you go through the algorithm, you get about 100,000 direct jobs attributable to freight in the region. And once you include the multipliers, you're at about 180,000 employees. Now you compare this to about 500,000 employees as your base, and in total we're looking at about a little over a third of the economy in total is either directly or through multiplier effects related to freight dependency. And those 180,000 employees are about $9.5 billion in labor income, which, similarly to the employment composition, is a little more than about a third of the economy, once you include the multiplier effects. They end up producing about $16 billion worth of goods and services, which, similar to employment labor income, also is about a little more than a third of the economy. And they sell about $32 billion, which is more than the other compositions in terms of percentages. It's closer to about 44%. And I alluded to this earlier. It's because there's certain industries in particular, most specifically manufacturing, that's relatively capital intensive. So it has a higher output sales value per employee than a lot of the other industries do. And so that's why output's a little bit more of an outlier. So that's what the freight-dependent industries through multiplier effects are measured in terms of the Tri-County area as a whole. This next slide I'm going to present breaks down the employment at about 180,000 employees across the two-digit industries that I had presented to you earlier, but this time sorted by highest impacted to lowest impacted by absolute magnitude, not necessarily industry percentage, which is the last number that you see to the right of the columns. And unsurprisingly, you look at the top of the list, these are the industries that are affected more pronouncedly than the others, and they are traditionally the goods industries. You have retail, waste, because you're moving to some of the waste products, manufacturing, construction, wholesale. Then you get into some other industries that are traditionally designated as services. And as I mentioned, some of the services are actually freight dependent, just not necessarily in a direct way. There's a supply chain of respending effects. So you have things like accommodation, and health services, and real estate that to some extent still has some freight dependency just through multiplier. And then you have some relatively smaller industries like agriculture, forestry, and fishing that almost entirely is freight dependent, but it's a rather small percentage of the overall regional economy. So, and what you can actually see here is in the white bar shows the remaining that are not affected, and government in particular, as you can see, is the largest industry in the economy with a little over 70,000 employees, but it's only about 6% of it is really freight dependent because they're not really consuming and producing a lot of goods themselves, and consumption on some of the military side, but it's not for a production process as all the other industries are designated. So all that together, we presented a number of numbers to you from a couple different databases, 3 different databases. We blend them together. And ultimately, what does freight mean to the region? Not everything that moves across the region is of economic relevance. There's certainly things like empty containers and the through traffic on 95 that will impact the infrastructure, but it doesn't really translate into the jobs and the economic activity of the region itself. So what we have to do is focus on the relevant directions and the relevant commodities. We've alluded to them already, and we have to dismiss or put aside the irrelevant ones that sometimes can actually dominate the tables and numbers that you would otherwise see in a freight analysis. You get rid of the through traffic, you get rid of the empty containers. And when you can focus then on what's economically relevant, you determine basically that the economy is about 1/3 to 40% freight dependent. And this is a pretty typical proportional percent of freight dependency for an MPO region, especially one that does not have a particularly high concentration of manufacturing. And while we went through the calisthenics and algorithms to determine the economic impact of about 180,000 people in the region, about 1/3 of the economy, the freight movements, especially the fact that you've got this intermodal transfer at the port that is facilitating movements well beyond the region to the Central Midlands, ACOG, Charlotte, Atlanta, and beyond, those movements, while not necessarily regionally specific or economically relevant, certainly are to those regions. So to some extent, the infrastructure network and the freight service providers in the BCDCOG are actually facilitating economic impacts, not only of the magnitude presented for the region, but in these other peripheral regions that could be of the similar magnitude. We didn't go through the calisthenics, a bit outside the scope, and it's more complicated, but it definitely facilitates economic impacts beyond the 180,000 that we have presented just for the BCDCOG region. So that basically concludes the content of our slides. I think I have one more polling question for you. So how will COVID change freight? This is not supposed to really be a trick question. Just get you to think a little bit.
There might be some trick answers, Evan.
Might be some more trick answers that we haven't even put on here, yes.
I agree. So while people are responding to that question, Rick Todd posted the question, what about fuel sales, other trade and activities from the through traffic? How is that factored into this?
It's basically through the multiplier effects through the in-plan model. We could have gone in there and made some sort of direct estimation of that, but doing so potentially introduces the possibility of double counting, doing it on the direct side and then counting it again through the indirect and induced multiplier effect. And because in our previous analysis doing freight stuff elsewhere, we determined that it's usually prudent to just write off as a small percentage. But it's a good question. It's a fair point. It just tends to kind of get baked in through the multiplier.
And another thing that would be a freight service related impact. When you look at freight service compared to the freight users, the freight service typically, depending on the study and the region, comprises somewhere between 2% and at the very most 10% of the total impacts. I know it's not that high here. And if you just take the fuel component out, that's just a small component of those total costs. So the relativity is very small. And like Evan said, If we were to pull that out specifically, it would be a double count. And if we were to tabulate it, it would be we would have to pull it out, because otherwise it would be a double count.
So with that, we're going to, the poll is closed. So yeah, most of you identified, there's pretty much all of these factors are likely to be in some shape, manner, or form affected by COVID. In particular, the increased reshoring, just for redundancy effects, we had observed a number of different commodity shortages, especially earlier in this pandemic timeframe, that if we had a little less foreign dependency on certain commodity groups, we would have had enough inventories to supply what was amplified demand at the time. I think there's going to be a little bit more of a refocusing on that, just so that we have something in our backyard. And in doing so, that also then simultaneously shortens some of the supply chains. Instead of being dependent of a cross-continental movement or trans-Pacific movement from something from China, you have a bunch of stuff, let's say, headquartered in Kentucky. That doesn't have to go instead of thousands and thousands of miles, but only maybe about 1,000 or less. And likewise, we'll have a bit of a shift in some of the international trade patterns because of the geopolitics of some of these foreign countries and how they've adapted or not to COVID and the after effect, and as well as their changing economies in the aftermath of this. But those in and of themselves are not the only potential ramifications of how society will change, and in terms of even the freight patterns. There are a few others, and maybe you guys can pose some questions at the very end. And with that, I think that's it. So I'm just going to open up to any general questions, comments, concerns. Feel free to open up your phone line or type something in the chat box.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Eric, for that overview. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that information resonates with everyone, that we do put the economic impact into those different categories in terms of percent of our labor output. It's good to see those different categories because there's no one magic number, and it's helpful to me to see that cross section, to see where freight does impact our community. And to me, it tells a great story to be able to say to the traveling public, to our decision makers, our elected officials, and others that, freight mobility, if it's not healthy, you're talking about 35% of our region's labor force is dependent on efficient freight mobility. So we certainly want to make sure that stays healthy and resilient and safe and efficient. So taking a look at the clock, we've got just under 10 minutes left. Not a whole lot more information to share today. Just a reminder to mark your calendar that our next meeting is November 12th. We do not yet have a Lunch and Learn webinar scheduled. We are hoping to do one that day, and we have a topic that we're working on, but so please be on the lookout for the announcement on what that content will be. However, that November 12th meeting is going to be critically important. As a reminder, we are trying to stay on schedule where we would like to finalize this plan early first quarter of 2021. So ideally, what we'd like to do is get these draft recommendations in front of you in November. And I know that this is a very, very busy time of year, to put it lightly. November, December is a very hectic time of year where not only are our partners in the industry very busy, but also personal lives get pretty filled up as well during the holiday season. So we want to give you that time to review this, digest it, have time to give us your feedback, because that will be the critical time to make sure that we are on the right path as we move into finalizing this at the first of the year. The other thing, I'm putting the Freight Plan website in front of you as a reminder, and I'm just going to make another plug to please feel free to push the online survey out to your network. We, as mentioned, it only takes a few minutes to complete this. Clearly, if you want to spend more time on it, or if a driver wants to spend more time really pinpointing lots of information, they're absolutely welcome and invited to do so. The other thing that will be happening over the next few weeks are some one-on-one interviews. The online survey is really designed for those drivers, users, operators, people out there in the industry. And then the one-on-one survey or interview is really more of a dialogue about what's going on with business today, where businesses are headed, how does efficient mobility help them, what concerns are they experiencing in terms of their mobility. Another good thing to talk through is sort of how is technology evolving for different companies, and are they looking to different modes? Are they looking to different types of vehicles? What types of things are they looking at to improve their efficiency in coming years? Because I'll tell you, it's great technology seems to change every few weeks, so it's always exciting to get that input and make sure that from the government standpoint, from the public sector standpoint, we know where the public system or the public network can complement and support those goals. So with that, I don't see any more questions coming in, but I do know that Sarah has her audio set up. And just to close out the meeting, Sarah, were there any other thoughts or messages you wanted to share with the group?
Thanks, Jenny. Yep.
Sarah, your connection is fading in and out.
No, well, we'll follow back up with Sarah. Please make sure that if you do have input, comments, please take the time to digest this information, and please be on the lookout as we do prepare that brochure-style executive summary of the economic analysis, because we hope that will be a helpful tool for all of you in your various industries and realms of influence. So as we've maintained with all of the other meetings, this has been recorded and will be hosted on the plan website. So if anyone in your circle's interested, please feel free to share that with them, and I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks for everybody's time today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.